A very good morning, folks, and welcome yet another edition of WealthWise with Edelweiss, a webinar series on markets, economy, and a lot more. Joining us today are two esteemed guests from our Edelweiss professional investor desk, or should we say the research from our wealth management team. Uh, all of you must be probably knowing Mr. Sahil Kapoor and Miss Ankita Pathak, but let me do the pleasure of again introducing the gentleman and the lady to you again. Sahil, as you know, is the chief market strategist, and by his own admission, is a person who observes, listens, and experiences to the economic change to weave the insights into his narrative. He has been a person of stellar experience, more than 14 years of experience in the markets and economical area. And with him, we have our very own and the youngest economist, one of the youngest economists, if I say, Ankita Pathak, who has been a keen economist, a person with a stellar experience in economics as well as finance. And she would be interviewing or having a dialogue with Sahil on the topic that is budget. Before I move further, uh, as an introduction, last year has been difficult, as you all know. All eyes are set up on the budget and probably hopes of a revival or some assistance of a revival. So now, before I pass it on to Ankita, I would just like to inform you that there might be a possibility of a 10 to 15-second lag due to technical issues at either sides. I request you to please bear with us. Thank you. Ankita.
Thanks, Zohar. Thank you for the lovely introduction you just gave out. And as you rightly said, that the year that has gone by has been difficult. It's been difficult for us in a certain sense, and also for the economy. I mean, it's cliche to say that it was unprecedented. Pura economic shutdown that we saw was not something the policymakers would have imagined when they laid out the budget in last February. So the budget for FY21 was made at a more normal kind of environment, and what came to us and is now kind of culminating into a new normal that we are in. Of course, there were a lot more announcements that came on the way while Atmanirbhar packages 1, 2, 3, and early extension of cash subsidies, direct transfers that were made in effect to nail the pandemic. Now, what that has done to our fiscal picture is kind of important, and I think for the rest of this webinar, this is the core that we are trying to figure. One is, what is the fiscal temperament of the economy and our policymakers as we move into this post-vaccine healing recovery kind of phase for the economy. The second, I think, big question is there is no way we could have met the fiscal deficit targets amidst economic shutdown, loss of revenue, etc. But what is our take on expenditure? Where do we see where should the expenditure be? And how should the government rather go about it? We don't know, obviously, what exactly the numbers would be, but we do have certain benchmarking that we discuss it out during the course of webinar. And the third big, I think, factor for the budget is credibility. I think markets will be on lookout of good credibility and good signals from the policymakers. Those should be studied very thoroughly, I guess, and also at a time when your fiscal deficit does go up, which is also the ideal policy prescription as we speak today. But even if we exceed on the fiscal deficit targets, there has to be a credible plan to be able to borrow it. We will, again, during the course of this webinar, lay out on why we think borrowing domestically would not suffice and what the ideal policy prescription would be. And towards the later end, we will do the market outlook across asset classes in the webinar. So largely 4 things that we'd be looking out on is expenditure, receipts, fiscal deficit, how would you finance that fiscal deficit, and the market outlook post the budget that we are expecting. Now, as we start, and I think we published a note very, very recently on budget maths, and I mean, I understand budget maths does get daunting for a lot of us, many times, but there are still certain numbers that could help us better understand the budget on the day of budget. Okay, so last year, when the budget was made, the total expenditure was pegged at 30 lakh crores. So 30 trillion was the budget that was made for FY21. The key thing to be watched out for, and our expectation also is that in a year like FY21, there is no rationale for any expenditure cut. So 30 trillion was pegged in. If FY21 is below 30 trillion, if FY21 is below 30 trillion, that is a negative signal. We do not want any fiscal austerity in times of low growth that we are in. So first number to track on the expenditure front is FY20 number, which was the budget that was made at 30 trillion. The number for FY21 should look like somewhere very close to it. We do not want to see any expenditure cuts for a year like FY21. The second important number, I think, is to watch out for FY22 expenditure. And on that front, we are pegging in a 13% growth. So roughly about taking it to 34 trillion. That's what our estimation is. And I think it's very rationally projected, as we titled our note, that this and how the way this webinar is also titled. It's on a balance beam. This budget is all about being able to spend while having lower revenues, at the same time managing your fiscal deficit and outlook on ratings. So there is no one factor. I mean, it's a combination of many variables that come into this budget, which is why it's more of solving those linear programming equations where you have multiple constraints and then you find the optimal solution. So even this budget is going to be something like that. So when we look out there, but I mean there are obviously certain parts that shouldn't be compromised with. The most important is the total expenditure. So as I said, FY21 total expenditure was pegged in 30 trillion. Going forward, FY22 total expenditure should be 34 trillion. That is what our expectation is. We want 13% growth over the last year we've had. So one big number to watch is the total expenditure. Now, when we're talking of total expenditure, I think it's also important to watch how is this expenditure getting segregated. And I must say that India doesn't have too much space. No matter how much we, write about or read about loosening the purse strings for India and, expenditure should go up dramatically, it's not possible. And I will tell you why. It's India has a lot of expenditure, which is a committed expenditure. Now, committed expenditure I am defining as any money that is spent year on year, and there is a commitment to spend that money. So that includes your interest payments. I mean, we pay of the 30 trillion budget that we make, we pay about 7 trillion in just interest payments. We pay about 12 trillion in salaries and wages, pensions. Now, one fine day, you cannot stop this kind of expenditure. It will continue to go on budget after budget. So what it does is the very high interest payments and very high committed expenditure for the government, it reduces the space that's available for the government to do discretionary spend, to do need-based spend, and to do capital expenditure. And this discretionary and this capital expenditure is what we need now. It goes without saying that there is an expectation of doling out, SOPs to sectors which have suffered the most in the COVID, let's say hotels, travel, transport. one of them, and there'd be multiple such sectors that have suffered, and help to the stress sectors is needed probably, but that doesn't come in India very often. The experience has not been that great, and that's partly because our committed expenditures are very high. So as we stand today, our committed expenditure is about 10 to 12% of GDP already. So of the 30 lakh crore budget that we made last time, 20 was almost the committed expenditure. So that gives us very little space that's there for capex and discretionary spend. Nevertheless, there's an expectation and also the right policy prescription this year that money should be more spent on the capital expenditure side. This is because it has a higher fiscal multiplier, and we stand at a time when wages are subdued, jobs are not that great, unemployment numbers are rising. So you need to bring up that infra spend boost back in the economy. After agriculture, construction is the second largest employer in the economy. So the government needs to step up when private capex is falling, and the government capex has to nullify the economy. So that expenditure remains, that expectation and policy prescription remains strong. So while you are watching the total expenditure, and as I said, we benchmarked it to 34 lakh crores. If the number is close, it's probably a good expenditure amount that's been doled out to the economy. Anything less than that would be considered a fiscal austerity, something that we do not prescribe in the post-vaccine world that we are going. Now, of the 34 trillion expenditure, at least numbers close to 5 trillion, and talking very, very feasibly, should be on the capex side, and the remaining 29ish can be on the revenue side. And this mix, I think we should watch out for. 29ish on the revenue, 5ish on the capital expenditure, a total expenditure of 34 trillion. And obviously how the money is being spent. And I reiterate that there will be a huge chunk that goes to interest costs, salaries, wages, pensions, Narega, PM Kisan, all allied the farmers after the protests and the distress we've had. So these will continue, but what's the discretionary part, what is being done to help out the stress sectors, etc. I think markets will keep a very keen watch on those fronts. So that's largely on the expenditure front when we look at the budget. Now, on the revenue front, we are short of the revenue this year by about 5.5 lakh crores, which is obviously reflecting in the higher fiscal deficit. But it was expected, at least the fall in the tax revenue, which is about 4 lakh crores, was expected because we were in a world where there was no economic activity. So obviously indirect taxes fall and then started to rise. And tax revenue is a function of your nominal GDP. And mind you, we have the lowest tax to GDP ratio among a major economy. So our tax to GDP ratio is about 10%. So if the nominal GDP is about 200 lakh crores, our tax to we make about 20 lakh crores in the tax revenue. That's roughly between 10.5% and 11% is where we are, and that's lower than most other peers, Indonesia, Vietnam, Korea, and also definitely much lower than the developed world. Obviously, because a large part of Indian economy is also organized, does not fall into formal mandate of taxes, etc., which kind of is a separate, I think, policy making choices beyond the budget, that this tax to GDP ratio should eventually go up for India. But currently, how we stand, it's very easy to judge the tax part and the credibility of tax numbers on the budget. I think easiest ways to do, just look at gross tax revenue, look at the GDP projections. We are projecting a nominal GDP growth of 14% on this, low base of negative 4.2%. So as per our estimates, nominal GDP next year would be about 22 lakh crores, 22.5. So the gross tax revenue should be somewhere about 24 lakh crores. This is the number to watch out for credibility of revenues. The other part, which is, it has been quite disappointing in a certain sense, is the non-tax revenue and the capital receipts that we do, which is basically our divestments, etc. So this year, when we were last Feb, when the budget was made, we went out with a divestment target of about 2.5 lakh crores. Now that's 2.2 to be precise, and that's a huge number. I think 1.2 was meant to be divestment, and then another 90,000 crores was stake sale for LIC. We haven't progressed much. We've only done divestments of about 48,000 crores of budgeted 2.5 lakh crores. That's a very small number. BPCL, Air India, all deals have been pending, and we've not been able to execute these deals for quite some time now. So watch out for this number. This number could have done well, even at least in the second half of the year when economic activity was getting back. Stake sales could have happened, but given multiple reasons, stress on the balance sheets of the PSUs, etc., these have not gone through, which is stressing the revenue side even further this year. And the credibility of these numbers going forward should be watched at. If revenue projections are not close to are not credible, which basically means we'll have a very probably a smaller fiscal deficit, but markets wouldn't take it, and the chances of fiscal slippage would be very high. So as I was saying in the start, that the credibility is very important. Whatever glide path we choose to be on, that glide path should be credible. Thus, where the money is being raised from, that is very important. So we've spoken of expenditure expectations. As I said, 34 trillion should be the number that you should watch out for. Higher than that is probably on better. Lower is austerity. We do not want it. 29 trillion kind of a revenue expenditure, 5 trillion kind of a capital expenditure, and of course the measures beyond what is already committed to the economy. Something that can help allay stress to the specific sectors should be watched at. And there has to be a plan to kickstart infrastructure investments in India from the government, even if it doesn't commit in direct capex, and that's very important to generate a longer term and a higher fiscal multiplier. On the revenue front, tax revenues of about 24 trillion is what looks likely to us. Divestments, dividends, etc., would be pegged higher, but should be taken, with a pinch of salt. So after you include everything, and some 7.5 lakh crores is being transferred to states as stands the mandate from the 15th Financial Commission, I think we'll have net revenues of about 22 trillion. So we talked about 34 trillion of expenditure. We talked about 22 trillion of net revenue, which basically leaves us about 12 trillion in balance, which is largely the fiscal deficit. And Sahil, at this point, if you could come up and let us know how we could deal with this gap between the expenditure and revenue that we have, and what could be the credible path for fiscal policy to adapt now.
Sure. Thank you, Ankita. So I'll probably start off with the fiscal deficit number itself. And largely, I think last year, when the budget came out, or the pre-budget number was at about 3.5% of GDP. And eventually we ended up at 3.9% of GDP.
Sahil, sorry to disturb you. There have been some requests if we could alternatively speak between English and Hindi, please.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. So last year we ended up at 3.9% of GDP in terms of fiscal deficit number. But this year, if you see, that number has gone to about 7.5%, the FY21 number. Expectation है कि जो 3.9 last year था as a percentage of GDP, that will be 7.5% roughly this year, which is a very, very large jump. अगर आप देखोगे historically, lot of people have time and again said even a 50 basis point jump in fiscal deficit is seen as a big thing. You know, markets look at this number very, very carefully. A lot of participants, even economists and market watchers like us, they will tell you that 3.5 and 4 makes a lot of difference. लेकिन अब इस साल देखो ये number, and largely what has happened is कि ये बहुत सारा जो jump है that has been taken care of through extra borrowing by the Reserve Bank of India. So RBI has taken the onus on itself, to probably help the government get a very large borrowing going. तो अगर आप देखो ये जो difference between revenue and expenditure, the difference that Ankita just spoke, this year if you look closely, FY21 में गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया का टोटल एक्सपेंडिचर होगा अबाउट 30 लाख करोड़, एंड जो नेट रेवेन्यू है इट विल बी अराउंड 16.5 to 17 lakh crores. So this 13.5 lakh crores difference is the fiscal deficit this year. और इसका जो डिनोमिनेटर है हम इसको परसेंटेज में कैसे देखते हैं? Indian GDP this year nominally will be 195 lakh crores. So if you divide 13.5 lakh crores of deficit, which is between जो हमारी कमाई है और जो हमारे खर्चा है, उसका जो डिफरेंस है 13.5 लाख करोड़, उसको अगर आप नॉमिनल जीडीपी से डिवाइड करो, you will get a number of close to 7% of GDP. That is going to be the fiscal deficit in FY21, according to our estimate. These estimates vary between 6 to 8%. A lot of people have put in, but we feel that this is a very, very moving number. It could be higher by 50 basis points or closer to 7%. ये जो difference है in the fiscal deficit, generally अगर आप last 4-5 साल देखेंगे तो this used to be around 6.5 lakhs to 8 lakh crores. जैसे FY19 में नंबर 6.5 लाख करोड़ था, जो डेफिसिट का नंबर है, that was our fiscal deficit, which was around 3.4% of GDP. Then it moved to 8 lakh crores in the budget estimate last year. When the government gave a budget estimate in FY20 for FY21, in budget 2020, they said that this number will be around 3.5% of GDP. But what we are ending up is at 7% of GDP. तो ये जो difference है, अगर आप इसको ध्यान से देखें, between 8 and 13.5, which is 5.5 lakh crores. This is the number that Ankita spoke about, कि 5.5 लाख करोड़ का जो difference है, that is what is going to be a problem area in terms of borrowing. So ये जो fiscal deficit है, इसकी financing कैसे होती है? I think that is one of the most important points. Ankita has already covered that expenditure growth should continue. That means government of India should continue to spend more money. तो अगर आप numbers ध्यान से देखें, what has happened is in FY21 the government has kept its pace of expenditure steady. You know, it continues to spend money as it had budgeted in last year. लेकिन उसके जो आमदनी है, जो revenue side है, that has got hit, and that is why our fiscal deficit has gone up. Okay, now in FY21, अगर आप ग्लोबली देखेंगे, बहुत सारी कंट्रीज ने क्या किया, अपना फिस्कल डेफिसिट नंबर को एक्सपोनेंशियली बढ़ा दिया है. जैसे मैं आपको रफ एग्जांपल देता हूं, यूएस की जीडीपी तकरीबन $20 ट्रिलियन थी कोविड होने से पहले, तकरीबन 20.5 के आसपास, और उनका बजट डेफिसिट तकरीबन 3.5% के आसपास चलता था, राइट, रफली अराउंड 3% ऑफ जीडीपी. तो अगर आप उनका 3% ऑफ जीडीपी लेंगे तो तकरीबन 600-700 बिलियन का उनका डेफिसिट था. दिस ईयर वो नंबर बढ़ा के उन्होंने तकरीबन 3.5 ट्रिलियन कर दिया. ओके, दैट इज द अमाउंट ऑफ एक्सपेंडिचर दैट दे डिड टू सेव देयर इकोनॉमी. तो ये तकरीबन 9-10% के आसपास उन्होंने एक्स्ट्रा एक्सपेंडिचर किया. अभी यही नंबर हम इंडिया में देखते हैं, ये भी तकरीबन 200 लाख करोड़ है. ओके, और हमारा भी डेफिसिट तकरीबन 3.5 के आसपास चल रहा था, तकरीबन 6 लाख 7 लाख करोड़ के आसपास। लेकिन गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया का डेफिसिट हैज गॉन फ्रॉम, जैसे मैंने आपको बताया, 7 लाख 8 लाख करोड़ का जो नंबर है उससे बढ़ के 13.5 लाख करोड़ हो गया। ओके, सो देर इज अ मैसिव जंप, तकरीबन 4-5% of GDP, but this is not as large as US and many other Asian. इसका क्या कारण है? Because government has not spent a lot of money. उसने बहुत ज्यादा fiscally accelerate नहीं किया इकोनॉमी को और मेजर फोकस रखा मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी पे. So RBI did the heavy lifting in FY21 by reducing rates, injecting lot of liquidity, allowing the government to borrow a lot of money. तो ये जो फाइनेंसिंग ऑफ फिस्कल डेफिसिट है, ये 13.5 लाख करोड़ रुपए हैं, ये कहाँ से आएंगे? ओके, जो FY21 का अगर हम एग्जांपल लें, ये ज्यादातर पैसा जो है वो गवर्नमेंट बोरोइंग से आता है. सो आउट ऑफ 13.5 lakh crores, all of it is helped by government borrowing. RBI has helped government of India by keeping rates low, doing a lot of OMO and other activities which has kept government borrowing relatively smoother. एक्सपेक्टेशन था कि ये बहुत बड़ा होगा. अब FY22 में क्या होगा? दैट इज वन ऑफ द मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट नंबर. Last year, if you remember, during the budget speech, the finance minister did not announce a fiscal deficit number. जब वो speech चल रही थी, generally एक set pattern है बहुत सालों से that the finance minister announces a number कि 3.5% of GDP होगा या अच्छा. Last year that announcement did not come. It was in the documents. So if that was the case last year, it could again be the case. But eventually we think that number is closer to 5.3% of GDP is quite possible in FY22. Okay, that is the number where fiscal deficit could settle at. Now this is lower than FY21, and some may argue that this amounts to lower fiscal expenditure and probably we need a much higher fiscal expenditure. But इसमें क्या है कि अगर आप total गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया का रेवेन्यू देखेंगे, FY21 में जब बजट एस्टिमेट बनाए गए थे कोविड से पहले, तो एक्सपेक्टेशन था कि तकरीबन 22.5 लाख करोड़ का नेट रेवेन्यू आएगा. वो ब्रेकअप अंकिता आपको ऑलरेडी समझा चुकी है. तो 22.5 लाख करोड़ रुपए का नेट रेवेन्यू आने की चांसेस थे. ओके, लेकिन वो रेवेन्यू नहीं आया. उसके बदले हमें तकरीबन 17 लाख करोड़ ही आया. तो 5-6 लाख करोड़ का जो शॉर्टफॉल है वो हमें रेवेन्यू साइड पे मिला. लेकिन गवर्नमेंट ने अपना खर्चा पूरा किया. सो इट प्रॉमिस्ड दैट इट will spend 13.5 lakh crores and it is doing so in FY21. तो लास्ट ईयर का 5.5 lakh crores that is going to continue. लेकिन इस साल क्या होगा? जो नेट रेवेन्यू है वो ओके, बिकॉज एज यू सी कि जैसे जैसे इकोनॉमी नॉर्मलाइज होगी, इनकम टैक्सेस विल कम बैक, कॉर्पोरेट टैक्सेस विल कम बैक. कॉर्पोरेट प्रॉफिटेबिलिटी हैज बीन मच हायर दिस ईयर, तो आपके कॉर्पोरेट टैक्सेस वापस आ जाएंगे. जीएसटी वापस आ जाएगा, जो टोटल नंबर है तकरीबन 1 लाख 1.25 लाख करोड़ रुपए का वो चलता है साल भर, तो दैट नंबर विल रीच 13 लाख करोड़ इन टोटलिटी, राइट. तो ये नंबर ऑटोमेटिक स्टेबलाइज हो जाएंगे, जहां पे आपके टैक्स रेवेन्यू ग्रोथ वापस आ जाएगी. तो चांसेस हैं कि आपकी टैक्स रेवेन्यू विल गो बैक टू एक्सपेक्टेशन. ओके, तो on tax revenue, both if they go up significantly, government will have a lesser problem in tackling its own revenues. उसके अपने जो आमदनी है वो नॉर्मलाइज हो जाएगी. लेकिन वो नॉर्मलाइजेशन इतनी बड़ी नहीं है that government will be able to give a fiscal stimulus. Okay, for that it will have to slip on its own fiscal deficit number. So we feel कि there are two possibilities. One is that government will pitch in a number of 5.5 lakh crores, or there is a good possibility that it can give a band. वो ये बोल सकते हैं कि FY22 में the fiscal deficit will be between 5 to 5.5 or 6% of GDP, or probably they can say that by FY24 or by FY25, that is in the next 3 to 4 years, we are going to bring down the fiscal deficit from current 7% to let's say 4%. Okay, so that makes a lot of sense to us. We feel कि एक glide path अगर वो देते हैं, it will be much more important. That will probably help markets understand कि government किस तरह का खर्चा करने वाली है आगे. Secondly, I think one of the more important points is कि ये fiscal deficit अगर बढ़ता है, जैसे इस साल 13.5 लाख करोड़ था, उसका पार्टली तो हायर रेवेन्यू से फाइनेंस हो जाएगा, लेकिन फिर भी हमें लगता है नेक्स्ट ईयर फिस्कल डेफिसिट तकरीबन 12 लाख करोड़ के आसपास होगा रफली। ओके, जीडीपी अगर जैसे अंकिता ने बताया 222 लाख करोड़ होगी, तो फिस्कल डेफिसिट विल बी अराउंड 12 लाख करोड़। सो इफ यू लुक एट दिस 12 लाख करोड़ जो एक्स्ट्रा एक्सपेंडिचर गवर्नमेंट करना चाहती है, विच अंकिता सेड विल बी 34 लाख करोड़, ये एक्सपेंडिचर कहाँ करती है इज गोइंग टू बी वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट इन टर्म्स ऑफ इकोनॉमी कैसे रिवाइव होती है। ओके, इसमें सबसे इंपॉर्टेंट और मूड पॉइंट क्या है, मतलब जब आप बजट स्पीच सुनेंगे या बजट डॉक्यूमेंट्स देखेंगे, what is that which is going to make the difference? Okay, so I'll tell you very specifically 2-3 points. First is गवर्नमेंट अपनी नॉमिनल जीडीपी कितनी लेती है, व्हाट इज इट्स एक्सपेक्टेशन। हम लोग बोल रहे हैं कि नॉमिनल जीडीपी विल गो बिटवीन 13.5 to 14%, हम ये हमारा एस्टिमेट है। मोस्ट लाइकली गवर्नमेंट विल आल्सो से दैट दिस इज गोइंग टू बी द नंबर। ओके, सेकंड इंपॉर्टेंट थिंग इज गवर्नमेंट ने ग्लाइड पाथ कितना दिया है। Is the government saying that fiscal deficit will fall from 7 to 4% within 2 years or within 1 year? That is very, very important. Okay, if it is very fast, it's saying कि हम बहुत जल्दी fiscal consolidation कर देंगे, that means खर्चा तेजी से नहीं बढ़ेगा, which is going to be a problematic area. We feel that government should loosen up its purse string. It is very, very important. Thirdly, जब वो अपना mix देगी, expenditure mix, वो किस तरह का देती है मिक्स। ओके, टाइम एंड अगेन आपने देखा होगा बहुत जगह पे ये बात की जाती है कि इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर स्पेंडिंग होनी चाहिए, फिक्स्ड एसेट क्रिएशन होनी चाहिए, दैट शुड बी द फोकस एरिया। मेरे ख्याल से इस बार बजट में गवर्नमेंट हैज टू फोकस ऑन रिवाइविंग कंजम्पशन टॉप टू बॉटम। Okay, it has to enact ways where it can probably allow more people to spend more money. Okay, that is how we are going to come out of this crisis. उसकी वजह से ही हमारी नॉमिनल जीडीपी बढ़ेगी। ओके, जैसे इस साल में आपको हमारी डेट टू जीडीपी जो 65% के आसपास थी लास्ट ईयर तक, इट विल इंक्रीज टू अबाउट 85%। ओके, सो देयर इज गोइंग टू बी अ वेरी लार्ज जंप, एंड गवर्नमेंट वुड वांट कि ये जो डेट टू जीडीपी है वो धीरे धीरे नीचे आ जाए। ओके, जो कर्ज है पूरी गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया पे या पूरी कंट्री पे एज अ होल, दैट शुड स्लाइड डाउन स्टेडीली। ओके, उसका सबसे इंपॉर्टेंट फैक्टर है कि हाउ फास्ट वी ग्रो। अगर हमारी ग्रोथ स्लो होती है, जैसे हमारी पिछले अगर आप 25 से 30 साल पकड़ेंगे, इंडिया की नॉमिनल जीडीपी ग्रोथ, ओके, रियल जीडीपी प्लस इन्फ्लेशन तकरीबन 12 से 14% के बीच में रही है, एंड विच हैज अलाउड अ वेरी फास्ट पेस ऑफ इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ इन इंडिया। ओके, नाउ व्हाट हैपेंस इज कि जब भी आफ्टर बजट, लेट्स से if our growth goes up, okay, for FY22, which is very, very easy to say right now, क्योंकि बेस इफेक्ट आने वाला है, FY21 का बेस बहुत छोटा है, तो FY22 में एज आई सेड नॉमिनल जीडीपी 14% से ग्रो करेगी, जो लास्ट ईयर तकरीबन 7.5% थी, तो इट विल डबल अप रफली। लेकिन आफ्टर FY22 there will be a very large base. Okay, so you can think about it कि एक लाइन सीधी जा रही थी, then it fell, then it started going up. तो ये जो बेस इफेक्ट है 2-3 साल तक डेटा में दिखते रहेंगे। लेकिन अगर हम FY25 तक का नंबर देखें, मतलब 2022, 23, 24, 25, इन 3 सालों में हमारा एवरेज नॉमिनल ग्रोथ क्या रहता है, दैट इज गोइंग टू बी वेरी, वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट। ओके, क्योंकि अगर वो ग्रोथ रेट 10% से नीचे होता है, ओके, और मे बी 12% से नीचे होता है, India ki growth will severely get restricted. Okay, that's why a lot of people feel that this budget is going to be very important. Of course, there are various ways even later to increase demand, and budget is only one event. It is not the final event in terms of policy making, but it will signal whether the government wants to increase our growth potential at a very fast pace, and that will probably allow this budget to showcase की ग्रोथ कितना होने वाला है। सो 3-4 थिंग्स, वन, व्हाट इज द ग्लाइड पाथ, गवर्नमेंट कितना ग्लाइड पाथ देने वाली है इन टर्म्स ऑफ फिस्कल डेफिसिट, फाइनेंसिंग कैसे होने वाली है, क्योंकि आप देखो बहुत सालों में हम देखते हैं, जैसे लास्ट ईयर गवर्नमेंट ने डिसइन्वेस्टमेंट का नंबर दिया 2.2 लाख करोड़, विच इज अ वेरी, वेरी हाई नंबर। वी हैव नॉट डन इवन 15% ऑफ दैट इन FY21. Of course, I think the market conditions were ripe in the last 3-4 months to do a lot more. लेकिन हम अभी तक वो अचीव नहीं हुए हैं टारगेट, स्टिल अराउंड month and a half to go. FY22 में हम क्या नंबर देते हैं, गोइंग टू बी वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट. सो लास्ट ईयर आप देखिए 3 नंबर बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट थे. एक तो आरबीआई के थ्रू जो डिविडेंड गवर्नमेंट को मिला, वेरी वेरी लार्ज सम. डिसइन्वेस्टमेंट तकरीबन 3.5-4 लाख करोड़ का ये रेवेन्यू गवर्नमेंट ने फैक्टर इन किया था लास्ट ईयर. इज इट गोइंग टू फैक्टर इन द सेम काइंड ऑफ नंबर इन FY22? दैट इज वेरी वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट. सो अगर गवर्नमेंट जो ऑटोमेटिक स्टेबलाइजर ऑफ टैक्स इंक्रीज आता है, मतलब के इनकम टैक्स, जीएसटी, एक्साइज ड्यूटी, ये तो सब बढ़ ही रहे हैं नेक्स्ट ईयर में बिकॉज इकोनॉमी नॉर्मलाइज हो रही है. तो जो बाकी डेल्टा है विच इट कैन गेट फ्रॉम disinvestment, which it can get from higher RBI dividend, okay, can it utilize this to enact a strong expenditure response in the economy? That is going to be very very important. And I feel that it has to be a very strong and able mix of both revenue and capital expenditure. We just can't say that you have to continue doing fixed asset creation. I think this is a year where you should also look at a mix of consumption boosting measures, jahan pe maybe some kind of a tax cut, okay, that is something which could be interesting. Tax rebates, increasing the minimum threshold of taxation, those things could be very interesting. उससे क्या होगा, लोगों को खर्चा करने की disposable income बढ़ेगी. Of course, there are a lot of expectations floating around that could there be a COVID cess, could there be higher expenditure. So I think a lot of those things are possible. Maybe we'll do a Q&A and talk about that. So probably I think I will stop here and I'll invite Ankita back and we will discuss some questions on what could be the possible areas where things could go right. So or probably where we should be keenly focused on. So Ankita, let me come back and ask you something which is quite important. Roughly, if you look at it on the budget numbers itself, what is the most important or crucial number that we should think about when we hear the budget speech? What is the most crucial number that you would want to listen to?
Yeah, Sahil, as I said when we started, ki times have changed. So लास्ट ईयर तक शायद हम वो फिस्कल डेफिसिट का नंबर ढूंढते थे, एंड एज यू सेड शी डिड नॉट इवन मेंशन इट इन द स्पीच एंड देन वी हैड टू डिग आउट द डॉक्यूमेंट्स. आई थिंक दैट नंबर वाज fairly a market mover in a lot of sense. I think this year fiscal deficit, even though it continues to be important, I think सबसे ज़्यादा important expenditure है. Fiscal deficit control करने के चक्कर में expenditure cut नहीं करना चाहिए. And as I said, the 34 lakh crore number, which is the actual fiscal outlay, and that brings me to the point that we have had multiple fiscal outlays this year. And तभी भी जो हमने फेब में बजट बनाया था 30 लाख करोड़ का, वो नंबर चेंज नहीं हुआ है. It's moving money, it's been loans, equities, guarantees, PLI scheme जो 2 लाख करोड़ का है, but it's like spread over 5 years. A lot of money has been, given out by creation of funds. NABARD के through आ रहा है. While those are important in their own, aspects, what's more important is कि actual कितना खर्चा सरकार इस साल इकोनॉमी में कर रही है. What's the money that's getting injected into the economy? So I think this year I will over focus on expenditure number and of course the internals, where it's going to come from. And secondly, I think I've read a lot of narrative recently ki, India's public debt will go to 85% of GDP, which is true. I think slightly more rather, but we need to understand that this is, how the world's been. I think for advanced economies, it's above 400% of GDP now. So with the, COVID, debt levels have made a new high, and I think that gives you more headroom to be able to, spend more. Like globally, the economies can align themselves, and there's a coordinated fiscal push that the developed markets have extended, and some emerging markets also have extended. We have not participated there, so this budget is a chance to participate there. And our usual worries that if you spend a lot, if fiscal deficit, your currency will depreciate. that won't happen when everyone's spending. So the drawback of extra spending this year is limited, which is why I think loud and clear I will over focus on the budget. What's the expenditure and what's the internals for it more than the fiscal deficit there. But your views, what are you watching for in this budget?
So I think I'll pick up with what you said right now, that globally countries and economies have gone to 400% in terms of debt to GDP. And, why not accelerate it a bit at even in India, why not spend more? I think it's a fair argument. Though probably we should look at spending more money even in FY22. Let me put it in number. If you look at the total size of Indian economy, roughly let's say कि 200 लाख करोड़ रुपए Indian GDP है. Okay. उसमें से 4.5 से 5% विल बी लॉस्ट बिकॉज ऑफ कोविड इन FY21. तो तकरीबन 10 लाख करोड़ का नुकसान इंडियन जीडीपी में हुआ है. हाउ डू वी रिक्यूपरेट दैट इज बाय एक्स्ट्रा एक्सपेंडिचर. प्राइवेट सेक्टर विल कम बैक, लॉट ऑफ इट विल कम बैक ऑटोमेटिकली, बट मेरा एस्टिमेट है तकरीबन 5-6 लाख करोड़ का जो एक्स्ट्रा एक्सपेंडिचर है वो गवर्नमेंट को अपनी पॉकेट से देना पड़ेगा, विच इज रफली अबाउट 2-3% ऑफ जीडीपी spread over, let's say, 2-3 years. And it can actually do that. It can allow some more money to be raised through borrowing and probably allow that expenditure to help the economy. लेकिन इसमें एक बहुत peculiar proposition है globally जो हो रहा है, वो है MMT, modern monetary theory. बहुत सारी countries पैसा print कर रही हैं और spend कर रही हैं. ओके उसमें जो सबसे मेजर मनी प्रिंटिंग मशीन है इस समय ग्लोबली, विच इज द यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स. ओके इट हैज स्पेंट अ ह्यूज अमाउंट ऑफ मनी in relief measure, fiscal policy, monetary policy. So think about it, when US prints money, okay, for example, US citizens have got $600, $1,400 checks. They are going to get $1,400 checks recently. When they use that check to, let's say, import something from China, or they want to holiday in, let's say, the Caribbean, that money, that fiscal stimulus that the US has provided, actually becomes a fiscal stimulus to where it is being spent. Okay, whether it is the Caribbean or whether it is some import from China. So the big fiscal stimulus that US provides becomes a fiscal stimulus to many other countries. Okay, where this money is spent, because it is incremental in nature. लेकिन इसका एक बहुत ही differentiated impact इंडिया में देखने को मिला है, that lot of that money, maybe I don't know how to quantify that, has come through the FI route to Indian financial markets. Okay, so rather than creating a very large fiscal stimulus in the main street, it has created a very large fiscal stimulus in the financial markets, and it has happened globally. Okay, so I think there are two ways of tackling this. एक तो जो global आपको tailwinds मिल रहे हैं उसको utilize करना जरूरी है. Domestically, what the government should focus on is using the extra expenditure to accelerate consumption. I think that should be a very important point. And also the second should be कि जहाँ पे shovel ready projects हैं, जहाँ पे जल्दी से turnaround time है, वो सारे infra projects पे focus करना चाहिए. For example, it's been 10 years that Mumbai doesn't have its second airport. Delhi doesn't have its second airport. It's been decades, right? So there are many aspects where a lot of fixed assets can be created. Maybe not in the next 1 or 2 quarters, but in the next 20 quarters, okay, or 15 quarters. Government should focus on that. That will provide a very large boost to the economy. So I will look at a number. Or rather the complexion of expenditure. Government कहाँ खर्चा करने वाली है, and if that expenditure helps and supports the bottom 20 to 30% of population, it will be good for the economy. क्योंकि top has already got a lot in FY21. चाहे वो corporate tax cuts हो या higher savings rate हो, तो जो top consumption economy India की, it has done well. So now the bottom has to come back because वहाँ पे unemployment के बहुत scars हैं, right? So I think I'll look at a mix of how expenditure is done. That is going to be very, very important. So Ankita, let me come back and ask you a question on, let's say, the debt market. Okay, because इतना सारा expenditure हम लोग बात कर रहे हैं. Secondly, we are talking about such huge government borrowings. FY21 में state plus center plus IEBR is going to touch 27 lakh crores or so. What is your outlook on debt? आपको लगता है यहाँ से interest rates गिरेंगे या बढ़ेंगे? What do you see?
Sure. Thanks, Sahil. And before I go on to the pointed question, I think there has been what debt market has taken it to be a change in liquidity stance. So we saw short-term yields have risen quite a lot, and long-term yields have not shown transmission. And I think we've spoken this before. Ki our repo rate is at 4%. Our yields are still fairly sticky at 5.9. So जो हमारा term premium है वो बिप्स का है. Historically ये term premium 80 bips का होता था. तो even if there is fiscal pressure, even if there is a lot of more borrowing happen, this is slightly on the higher side, and adjusted for the fiscal pressure also, this should be closer to, let's say, 150 basis. So about 5.5 or 5.4 would rather be a 10-year yield target that we should be looking at. नहीं होता है ये क्योंकि fiscal का worries बहुत ज़्यादा है. Inflation अभी आया है control में, but I think debt markets have been fairly wary of those. And very recently we saw this short-term hike. A hike in the short-term yields. Good. I think they moved up from 3.5 to good 4.2 eventually. So 70 bips hike because of the variable rate, repo rate transaction that was done by RBI. And I think it's very important that the central bank communicates properly. When what they rolled out the announcement, short-term yields went back. Then they were clarifying at different forums that, we are surprised by this yield movement and this is not we wanted. We wanted accommodative policy and we are here to, have liquidity for a longer tenure. So I think communication is very important. Guidance is very important at this time when, economy has its own multiple worries. So I think that one thing should come in. And secondly, I can also read a question that what is more important this time, fiscal or monetary? I think it's coordination that you need. And जैसा हम debt की बात कर रहे थे, तो ठीक है अगर हमारा debt 85% of GDP हो गया, which is likely the number we'll reach this year. How will you manage this debt? What's the most sustainable way to manage this debt? आप अपना interest cost कम रखो, तो आपको debt servicing पे जो खर्चा हम कर रहे हैं, we can pay lesser there. And secondly, you spend and you increase your growth because when we say 85% of GDP, if your denominator goes up, debt levels automatically comes down. So there's just two ways to sustainably manage this debt. One is lower rates, higher growth, and any policy that can get us to these two focus points is a to-do, and it's meant to be a coordinated effort between fiscal and monetary. So interest rates, even though we've seen a good fall owing to the COVID at 4%, moving down about 150 basis from the high, I think this is not a call on what RBI will do, but rather a prescriptive call that there should be brought down further because even now our real rates are higher than our peers, and as there is global tailwind that should be used at this point, and it makes little sense for government to borrow at 6% when governments across the world are borrowing it under 1% and doing well for the economy. So India has not been able to do that thus far. So ideal policy prescription is that interest rates should move a tad bit down even from here. Looking at how RBI has been thinking, inflation has just fallen under control, but next quarter we'll be growing on this 24% negative GDP growth. So suddenly growth numbers will look like 30-40% growth for the Q1. So at that point, will RBI start over focusing on growth coming back and not cut rates? That's also a very likely chance. So overall, coordinated fiscal and monetary policy is what we want. जब fiscal deficit का number high आएगा, we want RBI to mop up that supply, and we want more OMOs to come in. I mean, setting up a SPV and direct monetization would be very, very ideal. But even if not, then secondary market mein through OMOs, RBI should step up, mop up that supply, which means that apart from a very intermittent spike, I continue to believe that yields should move towards 5.5% on the longer tenor in, let's say, a quarter or so, but likely spike during the budget time. Sahil, there is also a question on, how things will change in terms of borrowing cost for the sectors, and which sector you would be watching out for.
So I think what has happened is in FY21, if you look at the total yield curve, अगर आप देखोगे short to long maturity, तो जो हमारा shortest part of the yield curve है, call money है या 1 year borrowing है, it has fallen significantly. So roughly, I think the fall is more than 300 basis points in terms of actual borrowings. Many corporations have borrowed three quarters of 3% in at least 6 to 9 months. Okay, but jo longer end hai, it continues to trade at a 6.5-7% plus bracket for most corporates. Okay, but eventually, I think jo higher rated paper India mein, at least the corporate paper which is rated AAA plus, for that interest cost has fallen a lot, and it has reflected in very high valuations for these companies. Okay, so from a sector perspective, I think now the focus will turn where interest rates are falling for the borrowers. For example, it is a housing sector where I think it makes a lot of sense. We have seen similar cycles historically also. That the borrowing cost for mortgages come down, it is beneficial for the housing, residential housing sector, which is probably getting played and cooked into the market right now. Secondly, I think other white goods which are slightly expensive and they require financing, wahan pe bhi I think iska support is quite usable. I think these are interest rate sensitive sectors which are probably going to get the benefit, jahan pe borrowers ke rates are going to fall. I think that is going to be very important. For corporate borrowers, where companies borrow money, wahan pe I think majority of delta has been cooked in, at least when we look at our current policy, because RBI hasn't really tried to bring the long end of the bond curve, जो 10-year maturity plus है, ये 7-year maturity plus है, वो प्रोफाइल को नीचे लाने की अभी कोशिश नहीं की गई है, और वहां पे बहुत borrowing होती भी नहीं है corporate sector में. It is usually 3 to 5 years. But I think that is the curve where the most crucial part in terms of corporate borrowing will play out. It hasn't played out right now. So I'll be more focused on the borrower, which is the consumption part of the equation, jahan pe play out hoga. Yeah.
And Sahil, I mean, we've spoken about this within ourselves multiple times, but about valuations being stretched, earnings rebound being there, but not being super high. So what is your outlook on the equity markets post-budget and a generic outlook on the equity markets? Are you still adding equity?
Sure. So I think because budget has been a very important event, at least from the volatility in the markets, it has been an important event. Over the last few years, you've seen January, that is the pre-budget months, or post-budget market action has been ferocious. If you remember in 2018, when LTCG came about, market had a huge fall. So you can't really dismiss the budget in terms of the market movement. So I think it's an important event. It becomes more important because we had a very, very strong rally. I think since November, equity markets have rallied almost 3,000 points on the Nifty, which is a very large rally, I think 20% plus. Secondly, as you said, if you look at the valuations from a historical standpoint, Nifty is trading closer to 22, 23 times FY22, which is एक साल आगे की earnings है. which is quite high. Historically, this number has been closer to 16 and a half, 17 times. So there is a very, very large amount of premium built in versus historical averages. Thirdly, if you look at standard measures, historical market cap to GDP is inching closer to 100% of GDP. Again, a very, very large number, right? Thirdly, if you look at our bond to equity ratio, the bear ratio, that is also not signaling a comfort level. So I think there are, from a historical standpoint, plus the event, you should probably be a little careful, a bit cautious, at least for the next 15, 20 days. What is favoring and helping the market sustain this rally are a tremendous amount of flows. Okay, FI flows have been very, very strong. So November, December saw about 60 and 65,000 crores of FI equity flows, and in January this year, in the first 22 days, we've got another about 25,000 crores. So these numbers are very, very large. They are not small numbers, and they have helped the market to a very large extent. So I think until they continue, probably the market outlook will remain positive in terms of the short-term behavior. But I think at this moment, and this trigger, probably you should wait and watch. You should be a little cautious. Thirdly, I think it has to be more sector and stock specific rather than only index specific. You have structural stories being played out in chemicals, in insurance, which are, I think, irrespective of how market does in the next 1 year or the next 3 to 5 years, these sectors are going to do very, very well. So, जो transient stories हैं, cyclical stories हैं, जैसे auto है, which has gone through its ups and downs. IT hai, which has got a lot of favor from COVID. Pharma hai, which gained a lot in the last 6 months. These short-term gyrations will continue, and probably we are at a overbought territory in many of these stories. So probably in the next 3 to 6 months, there will be some corrections. It will come in. Okay, and so we should be cautious for that. But an investor who is 3 to 5 years in horizon probably will look at FY22 constructively and utilize these corrections, whether it is caused by a budget or not, to add to positions.
Okay, thanks, Sahil. There are a lot of questions which is on increase in taxes, COVID cess, etc., change in hike in duties. All I would say is that that's counterintuitive. It should not happen in a year like this. But last year, again, we saw a hike on petrol duties when global crude prices were down. So our excise duties went up some 50% between last year and this year, even when our fuel consumption was down 20%. So is there an expectation something on a higher cess, hikes, etc. should come in? Ideally, no. That's not the prescription we would look at it at this point. We won't look at increasing taxes either. I mean, it's a year where you cut taxes, increase the disposable income, as Sahil rightly said in narrative. So that if there is an opinion on it, or if there's a prescription, that is looser fiscal policy is the way to go. Also, Sahil, there is a question on gold. One of the clients has probably asked that it went up and has corrected a little. So how do you see gold panning out?
So see, gold, I think, is an interesting asset class, at least for the next 2-3 years. We wrote a detailed report on gold where we've highlighted that in the next 2 years, gold prices could very well go up to $2,600 to $2,800. India may that will translate to about 70,000 to 75,000 rupees. Okay, that is the outlook on gold. Why? Globally, I think there is a huge rush of money printing. Deficits have gone up. And in the last 100 years, I think there is a very good chart in our gold report, which is available on edelweiss.in, which shows that every 50 years, gold gets repriced because there is a financial debasement which happens time and again. So possibly, I think that episode is occurring again, and which will benefit gold prices over the next 2-3 years. Our strategy on gold is that whenever it declines below 1850, specifically towards $1,750 on global prices, that becomes a very good entry point for gold, because मेरे ख्याल से global volatility is going to rise once again. जो हम फैक्टर्स देख रहे हैं, जैसे डॉलर में थोड़ा रिबाउंड आ रहा है, इक्विटी मार्केट्स ग्लोबली बहुत महंगे हैं. ओके, सो आई थिंक देयर विल बी हायर वोलेटिलिटी इन द नेक्स्ट 3-4 months, और गोल्ड विल आल्सो बिकम अ लिटिल मोर वॉलेटाइल, एंड दैट वोलेटिलिटी शुड बी यूटिलाइज्ड. वहां पे हमें खरीदना चाहिए गोल्ड with target towards 2600 to 2800 globally.
Sure. So
Yeah.
buy on dips, I think, at below 1800, specifically at 1750 levels globally, for a 2600 kind of a target in a few years. And as Sahil mentioned, we did write a detailed report on it. And that brings me to a lot of questions on printed material. So we have, printed a note on budget, which will have the budget math, our rationale, everything. Again, it's available on edelweiss.in under macro research section that can be used. So Sahil, I think that's largely the questions we've had today. We would rather wrap up here. Any concluding remarks?
Yeah. So I think in conclusion, we think that 2-3 numbers are very crucial to watch. As you said, fiscal deficit number, a glide path rather, not a fixed number. Secondly, the expenditure growth, very, very important. Third, government's expectation of a nominal GDP growth, going to be very, very important. Higher the better. Expectation should be closer to 13 to 15%. And finally, we should look at what kind of mix the government is looking at, how to accelerate the growth. How is the government going to do that? These are going to be very important. And over the next 10 to 15 days, you should be careful, cautious, because markets are going to get volatile, because they have ran up a lot in the last 2-3 months. So you should be careful looking at that. So I think that's it from our side today. Thank you very much for joining. And we'll probably wrap up here. Thanks a lot.